Welcome to part 4 of our Whitewright Church of Christ history. I have a correction from the previous presentation. I said that the fellowship hall was added in 1984. That's not correct. It was added in 1988. The first event we had in that was in November 13, 1988. I want to talk a little bit more, conclude my discussion of the disbanding of the Christian church. I don't feel hesitant about talking about Christian church because they're part of our own history. Should never have been a division between us. We have this record in the Whitewright Sun that the Whitewright Christian Church, Central Christian Church, is no longer meeting. This appeared in March 1960, 64 years after the division. And then a year later, we have another notice on April 2nd, 1961. We have a notice that the Christian Church has resumed its services. And then 20 months later, December 1962, there's another notice in the Whitewright Sun that the church was assembling, but these notices had appeared during this whole time, weekly, and this is the final time any such notice appears. So I'm fairly certain that the final dissolution of the church occurred in December of 1962. Following its disbanding, the Christian church, a few of its members reassociated with the Church of Christ. So, to that degree and in that sense, the Christian church and Church of Christ reunited after 66 years. A question might arise in our minds. It does in my mind. Why did the Church of Christ survive here in Whitewright, but the Christian church did not? I have to believe that the introduction of musical instruments into the worship assembly was something that represented an annulment of the fundamental premises upon which the Restoration movement rests. That is, to ground all of our faith and practice in the New Testament and to limit ourselves to what can be grounded in the New Testament. When they transgressed that boundary, then they kind of lost their rationale for existence. And I think the Christian church in general in the United States is facing this same thing. They're no longer as strong, as powerful as they once were. And their rationale for their existence has really disappeared with this violation of those premises upon which the Restoration movement rested. A few newspaper items of interest. In 1913, in the Whitewright Sun, we find that the church avoids a conflict with the Baptist revival. He says there's a revival in progress at the Church of Christ. It will close Sunday night so that it won't conflict with the Baptist meeting to miss Sunday. So the meeting has resulted in 13 additions, 3 reclamations. So they're making an effort to close their revival so as not to conflict with the Baptist revival. Very interesting. And then we find the Baptists avoiding a conflict with the Church of Christ. Owing to the revival meeting at the Church of Christ, services were withheld at the Baptist church Saturday night and Sunday night. Evidently, they continued their Lord's Day meeting Sunday mornings, but any Saturday night or Sunday night service was dismissed because of a gospel meeting at the Church of Christ. In 1917, I found this notation that the Reverend R.C. Bell will preach at the first Christian church in this city next Sunday. Well, of course, there was no first Christian church officially, but we find the church, this has to be the Church of Christ, because the Central Christian Church, very specifically its name, and R.C. Bell was associated with the Churches of Christ. Then again, in the same year, Professor J.L. German will speak Sunday morning and night at the First Christian Church. So I don't know if this is a misunderstanding by the Whitewright Sun editors, or if there were times when the Church of Christ, the Church of Christ, still retained its name, the Christian Church. Then this was an interesting notation that I saw in 1923 from the Whitewright Sun. Had found an article in the Rosebud newspaper talking about an evangelist W.N. Carter of Whitewright, and they're very complimentary. Says that they had just closed a meeting. It was one of the largest attended all the way through, conducted by this church, or in fact in this town. And the church is to be congratulated in that she can have such a gifted man in ranks as Evangelist Carter, one that is not afraid to put before the people such strong sermons of the Church of Christ. Well, evidently, W.N. Carter was a long-time resident from childhood up until most of his life. He lived here in Whitewright. And in fact, for a couple of years, he evidently was the minister here. But then most of his many years of being in Whitewright, he was a traveling evangelist. But he appears in the paper several times as conducting funerals for people who passed away. So maybe he was an elder in the church here, but here's a very prominent evangelist for the church living in Whitewright. And evidently, he must have had some impact on the church here, but one could do a biography on him alone. And it's just something, he doesn't show up normally in the history of the church here. And this was a very fascinating article that appeared in 1923 about the Easter cantata, which pleases a large audience. And I'll just read this. The Easter Evangel by Lorenz, given at the Presbyterian Church Wednesday evening, was one of the best musical programs ever given in Whitewright. Before the time arrived for the program to begin, every seat in the edifice was taken, and many people were not able to secure seats. Over 30 of the best singers here took part in the program, which covered a period of 2 hours. And the cantata was given under the auspices of the Parent-Teacher Association and was directed by Reverend J.A. Dickey, pastor of the Church of Christ. It's just an interesting thing, an Easter cantata, Presbyterian Church, directed by the minister of the Church of Christ. Just an interesting historical note. Again, in 1923, we find a record how that the Methodists are avoiding a conflict with the revival taking place at the Church of Christ. Just quite interesting. Another note from 1923, the 31 conversions at a gospel meeting in the Church of Christ. And then this notice in 1924 of an obituary from Mrs. S.H. Crawford. Says she died at the home of her daughter. And it says in 1873, the deceased joined the Church of Christ at Old Mantua, a pioneer Grayson County settlement. And her funeral was conducted by J.A. Dickey, pastor of the Church of Christ. So, yes, she believed, or her family believed she came into the Church of Christ at Mantua, which is nearly always described as the Christian church at Mantua. But clearly someone thought it was the Church of Christ. Just shows the interchangeability of those titles at that time. Again, in 1927, the church is avoiding a conflict with the revival at the Central Christian Church. Then I have a few kind of interesting snippets from Chumley's book on the Kentucky Town Baptist Church. August 8, 1857, according to the minutes, the Christian Order is granted use of the Baptist facility one Sunday per month. So this has to be not at the same time of the day, but at some point, one Sunday each month, they could have their services there. And again in 1858, there's a notation that Parson Littman of the Church of Christ preaches on the fourth Sunday at the Baptist Church. And then in October of 1858, the Baptist minutes reflect this. After this year, the Campbellites will have no further privileges in the facility. One wonders how effective pastor or parson or minister Littman had been. Was he too effective? Was he having too much effect? Then in December the 10th, 1859, the record declares that I.O. Perkins, Isaac, very prominent often in the minutes of the Baptist Church up until this time, had been disfellowshipped for already having joined the Campbellites. Now remember, it was in 1859 in August that B.F. Hall conducted his very effective gospel meeting and formed the Church of Christ. And evidently there was some question for a time after that as to the connection of Perkins with the Baptist Church, but finally they say he has already been a member and disfellowship for that. Then in April, a few months later, Perkins asked permission to conduct school in the Baptist church house. There's no evidence that he was permitted to do that. Perhaps he was denied. And even though he was a school teacher, and then his name never again appears in the minutes of the Baptist history. In 1862, we know that the Baptist facility was destroyed by a storm. And in December of that year, the Baptists want to meet in the Reformer's house. And the records indicate this may have gone on for as long, perhaps, as March of 1864. And Chumley has this notation in his book. Considerable research has not turned up anything about the Reformers organization. It must have been an organization of some note in its day to have its own meeting house in Kentucky Town. Well, he wasn't aware, but the Reformers is clearly a reference to the Church of Christ. That was one of the names by which they were known. So the Reformers' house, the Church of Christ house of meeting, was the one where the Baptists ended up assembling beginning in 1862. Then moving forward a few years, July 13, 1878, Blanche Parish has been disfellowshipped for unchristian conduct in joining the Campbellite Church. And then not long afterward, in October, Catherine Parish disfellowshipped for joining the Christian Church. And then in November, the very next meeting, the minutes are amended to say strike out Christian Church and replace it with Campbellites. And then, according to Chumley, the Parish family became pillars in the Church of Christ at Tom Bean, which was established a few years later. On May 10th of 1879, the minutes reflect the following. The Campbellite Church is to be allowed the use of the Baptist facility one Sunday each month. And immediately following that, there's a note, a lock has been ordered for the church doors. I don't know if there's a some ironic reason for that following there, or whether there's any connection at all. Then in June of that same year, and note this is after the moving of most of Kentucky Town over to Whitewright, but evidently there were still some who considered themselves to have a church there in Kentucky Town, and they want to use the facility. So the building that they were meeting in had been moved, but there were still a few there, and so they wanted to stay and meet some. And it says in June of that year, the Christian church had been informed of the May 10th decision. And then in July, it says the minutes of June 7th need to be amended to replace the Christian church by Campbellites. Well, a few observations from just this history of these years. Note how often the facilities were shared among the different religious groups. As they were unselfish. They were willing to share different facilities. And then how often, despite inter-church antagonisms at various points in time, these antagonisms were set aside for sharing together. And then we have the connections with the Mantua Church, which occurred several times in the course of our examination of the history. And the Mantua Church being the very early reflection of the Churches of Christ in Texas. I was interested to notice that preachers are nearly always termed elders in these early days. Whether they're qualified or not, according to 1 Timothy 3, they were the elders, and I guess others were deacons. Thought there was evidence for the observation there were many excellent part-time preachers. Of course, there were few churches you really could afford full-time preachers in that day. So if you were a preacher, most of the time, in the earliest times, you were a part-time. You were not full-time. I thought it was very interesting how often the different religious bodies accommodated each other's events. And the question arises, were not the believers from the different churches on a better footing when they had more communication with each other, more respect for each other? Even if they didn't agree and even if they had differences, wasn't it better when they could communicate, share, and have some interaction? Then I think the destructive potential of church splits is a lesson that we can see. Even though the Church of Christ and the Christian church coexisted for 64 years, I don't think after that division, either one of them was ever quite as strong as they had been before. Well, my survey doesn't cover a lot from the 1930s forward. I really hadn't intended to do a lot. Maybe at a future time we can look more closely at those years. And then, though beginning in the 1960s to the present day, a couple of notations. Beginning in 1960, for about 10 years, Wallace Manette was the minister. The next year, in 1970 and 1981, Bill Baker was the preacher. And then in 1982, until I retired in 2007, I was the preacher here. And I tend to think that some of these long tenures was a blessing to the church and probably a blessing to the preachers too. Then since 2017, Tyler Lewis, our minister, has been our ministry 3 years and counting. Tyler educated at Lubbock Christian and the Duke Divinity School, and this is his first full-time ministry. We feel very fortunate to have him. The Whitewright Church of Christ, we're still seeking to limit our faith and practice to what can be grounded in the New Testament. We're still seeking to find common ground with others who adhere to Jesus Christ, who want to be just New Testament Christians, encouraging them to join hands with us. And in conclusion, the church in this year of 2020 is populated with some very capable, competent young families. If it can retain the love of Christ and his distinctive message, I think it should have many spiritually productive years ahead of it and be able to bless generations yet to come, at least until the Lord himself returns. I have in preparation a history of the Whitewright Church from 1982, the year I came here, to the present. I'm working on this and perhaps be able to present it at some time in the future. Thank you for joining us for these presentations.